Um, thank you. Thank you.
Sounds good.
Great. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, John.
So just to give you some thoughts, first of all, about sort of the process that you used, particularly for submissions and stuff. So one of the challenges, right, for the feedback that you got from Jim Chrisman, is, I can understand, all right? And part of it is just sort of how you use a qualitative approach sometimes to make real contributions. And that's probably what his big criticism was, is there's no real contribution here. The interesting thing about qualitative studies is that you're able to use these. You have rich data, right? You have rich interview data, you have numerous responses, and the hardest part is to be able to make the contribution through either an abductive, which is what I'm pointing to Steve, what his kind of style was, versus sort of you all, Yoon and Lee, you did sort of an actual coding approach to try to create these categories and so on.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is that in both instances, both of these papers, you sort of took an existing sort of theoretical perspective or a definition and then fit your data to it. You said, well, this is about, in the case of the passion thing, I'm going to talk to you about passion, obsessive passion, the stuff by Valerian and so on. And then you did a qualitative study, and then you fit it back into the world of the obsessive passion conversation, right? That's why you got the feedback you got. Wow. Steve, it's the same kind of thing with your study. You had an idea about, well, what's going on, right? And you provided some background on sponsorship and some other areas related to paternalism, which is actually very fascinating. Then you did your qualitative study and did the abductive approach, and then circled back to fit it into those holes, right? So the thing I'm saying to you is that you have much more freedom than you think you have. So the real research questions should always be, when you're, in my opinion, from qualitative studies, is to show that there's a gap, that the gap is misunderstood. So for example, Steve, I was thinking about your paper, and you talked about Peter's paper, right? The legacy thing, him and Jim. I saw Jim just 2 days ago. The cool story, right, is, well, you know, there's a lot of conversations about the big research question, as I saw what you were trying to do, and I'm trying to read your mind, was Peter talks about legacy. That's sort of the stories in the past that help define and help reinforce our entrepreneurial world we hope going forward. But you could make a statement, right? Well, you know what? How does that happen, right? And that's really what you're trying to get at. So how does that happen? So what are some of the first things I thought of? Your data is really what I would call a cascade. So why? It's the why question that you're going to try to grapple with. And it may have this connection to the paternalism world, and I think it does. And all the different characteristics of the nudges that you talked about. So is it possible, for example, for you to claim, Peter says this, other people have tried to talk about how entrepreneurship works through family business structures and multi-generational firms. And you can say, well, you know what? We still don't know about that. What we could do is do some studies about the pieces that cause this to happen. And in your interview points that you made, you stated that, you know, there were multiple ways in which this paternalism kind of thing unfolded, right? Some of it was modeling behavior. Some of it was providing baseline resources and buffering, and so on. So maybe, right? Maybe your bigger question is is to free yourself a little bit from what others have said. This is what paternalism or sponsorship or whatever, and give yourself the freedom to say, I'm going to look at literally how this happens. And oh, isn't it interesting? After I looked at my qualitative data, I found these different mechanisms that can create, and this is just me coming up with the word, you can use whatever you want. You have basically an entrepreneurship cascade happening. And there are different pieces around that you can point to. How does an entrepreneurship legacy unfold? Well, it could be like this, and this, and this, and this. It's a cascade effect, right?
Somebody used had read this paper and they used the funnel effect, which is essentially the same thing.
Yeah. So that's your story. Your story is, yeah. We, got all these people trying to figure out how entrepreneurship works through a family multi-generational family enterprise. Well, let me give you another picture. And this picture is built around what we've kind of learned is sort of this cascade effect can happen. It happens in these particular ways, and you provide all the rich understanding about how a cascading of entrepreneurial activities happen. Some of it's from modeling, all the stuff you have in there. So you free yourself. And I'm saying that I'm not criticizing. I'm saying both papers are qualitative studies that should be freed from the constraints of trying to fit into what somebody else said. And that's why you got the feedback you got from Jim. And Steve, that's what I would do for you. I'd say, don't fit it into what they say the structures are. You build your own structure. This is your theory. This is your story to help understand that works. The same holds true, Yoon, for you. You mentioned passion as an organized or a potential organizing framework. The obsessive passion stuff, how painful it is, how hard it is. You also pitch this as a process model. Step. In the paper itself, though, we don't really see a process model. We see a categorization of the characteristics associated with letting go. But you never tell me that story. So typically in qualitative studies, the intro and the sort of setting the research question in the paper is about that big. That's the analysis or the descriptions of samples and analytic strategies. And then the biggest part of your paper is about your theory, your story. So like, for example, your discussion, your theoretical contributions, that's only about a page. You got a lot more of a story you can tell here, right? So the goal is set the research question, frame it in a literature stream that is the world you want to operate in when you do your interpretation, methods and analytic strategies. And then you have this big build out of what your theory, Steve's theory, Yoon's theory is on how this works. Then you've got a contribution, right? You've used your qualitative study, your qualitative data to build a new picture for us. So that's the general comments.
So what you're essentially saying is these should be theoretical papers, not just strictly just papers on building theory. Theoretical papers in their own sense.
In your case, Steve, I would say, okay. Yeah, you're building a theory of fill in the blank. I would call it paternalistic cascading effects, or I don't know, I'm making this crap up. It'd be the entrepreneurial cascades in family firms. Because as I read those comments, it seemed, and again, I'm not close to the data, it seemed like that's what was happening, that Luke was doing things, right? Modeling behavior, doing all these other things, and you could structure it into some kind of structure. And what Luke did, and this is the cool part about qualitative studies, you describe the contextual effects that caused the next generation to kind of do the same thing, right? Which led to the next generation. So it's this entrepreneurial cascade that you're describing. And so then what are the pieces that cause that? Well, then you circle back and say, you know, there's this stuff on paternalism. Well, you know, we can actually apply pieces of this now that I've got my data out here. And here's how an entrepreneurial cascade happens in a multi-generational firm. That's your story. I mean, is it safe to say that's the story you really want to tell?
Well, I think, you know, my original concept of tying it in with nudging theory, you know, might have been a little too cutesy. For
No,
lack of
I think it's okay. It's just you could tell a bigger story with what you got. You could lay out how does this is just me. How would an entrepreneurial cascade happen in a multi-generational family firm? Well, it happens by nudges.
So your research question.
Yeah, so think bigger about it. So with your study on the process of letting go, right? So the bigger story with your data is sort of the psychological detachment of that leads to, and you show this in your figure. The story then is how the real story is how do they psychologically detach A before they set up the processes B that lead to C, how they in fact engage in this letting go. So you've got a bigger story that you can tell. And what is that story? Well, let's label it something. What would you call the detachment process? Is there a word or a phrase you use? What would you guys? Steve, help us. If you got
Letting
something.
go.
What?
Letting go.
Yeah. So let's come up with a term for it, because academics got to have a term.
Rewinding, no, unwinding possessive bonds.
Yes, that's possibility. I love that word. Yeah.
Unwinding suggests multiple dimensions that you have, and yeah.
So maybe it's this unwinding conversation. And I'm very, very interested in doing interestingly enough, we're doing some consulting and advising study. I'm working on a chapter on that right now. But I personally have gathered data over the course of my career where we've interviewed brand new entrepreneurial firms. And one of the questions I always ask, a family business question, you know, do you consider yourself a family firm, i.e. a family a business wherein you're going to transfer ownership and management of the firm to a subsequent generation, the Jim Chrisman definition. What is fascinating to me is how many entrepreneurial firms see themselves as family businesses from the jump. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And I think it's right in line with what you're saying, that the family business piece, right, of a founding firm gets wound in real quickly. And now we're talking about unwinding it. So you're linking the entrepreneurship piece. That's what my plan is to link the entrepreneurship piece, the launch, a family business launch, a founding family business, a born family business is going to be my title somewhere in there. And how that happens. And you all have the unwinding side of that.
Yeah.
So you can link entrepreneurship, the identity and connections that relate to passion and so on at the back end of your paper to help discuss this unwinding conversation.
Wow.
Great.
And then the whole story is about building your theory around how psychologically unwinding happens.
Great.
Wow.
So I guess what I'm saying is, but both papers, you have qualitative data. You're like in an empirical study, you know, build your theory, find your gap. We're going to test these two variables. regression, here's our answer, here's our contribution. With you all, it's a qualitative thing. You're not constrained to that. You can build your own story based upon your interpretation of the data. Build your theory, the theory of psychological unwinding in family succession processes, and then run down that road. Steve, same kind of thing. You're free, for good or bad. You're free to do whatever you want with your elbows to build out the story you want to tell. And think big.
Excellent. Yeah, I agree that the data is the most important. And fortunately, we have very good data. So it's really a matter of how we can interpret and write a group paper out of it. So in that sense, may I ask, so in fact, we tried to do like that. So we didn't have any framework at the beginning. So we conducted lots of interviews quite with open questions. Then we found one, so we made a kind of general model, and among the model, we are very interested in the psychological aspects of the owners, the detachment, unwinding process. So that's why we put the unwinding and possessive bond, obsessive passion up front as a title, also in the literature review session. Then I realized that maybe it's just giving an impression to the reviewers that we started with the theory and tried to feed in like that. So
that's a good, so good.
So great qualitative studies. We've got a paper at SEJ that some hopefully will answer. It's all about the front part of your paper, your intro and sort of your lit review is really a lit review of the studies in the domain of your interests. So you're not going to be prescriptive. You're not going to say, we're going to study unwinding through passion.
Yeah.
You're gonna talk about the universe of sort of studies to set up the most important thing in the front half of that paper, which is the research question or questions that you're going to explore. So it's not that it's independent of theory. All you're doing is framing it in a literature stream. Okay. You know, there's been a lot, like for your paper, you could describe sort of briefly the universe of studies that have looked at succession from a psychological standpoint, broadly speaking. You know, they've done this and they've done that, they've done this, and the whole period of those pages, you're setting up for the story to say, you know what? All these studies that looked at psychological foundations of the succession process, you know, they talked about this and they talked about that, but we don't know certain things about what they talk about. And so our study is to look at the psychological foundations of the succession process. Methods, and analysis, and hopefully you're pulling out this unwinding story. Then the discussion kicks off. And the discussion is all about, and maybe you're linking back to theory, like, well, you know, we learned this. Oh, you know what? This is a lot like this obsessive passion business. So one of the things we need to do is incorporate this passion conversation in the unwinding process. And then some more interpretations, linking back to literature and theory that seems appropriate. Steve, same thing, right? Your story is about exploring the literature streams you want to look at to set up a research question that you allow your data to show you what you learned to build your theory about, I say, entrepreneurial cascades or paternalism approaches as an entrepreneurial cascade, or, you know, the how. That's the thing you got, which is the pieces of the how that happened. And oh, isn't it interesting? You know, we can use these insights from paternalism to create some new pieces about how an entrepreneurial cascade happens in a multi-generational firm. And it's because of this, and because of this, and because of this, and because of this. And you create your own story. about your story, not Valley Rand's story or not Peter's story, your story, right?
Good.
So
I have since you mentioned psychology and how psychology was such a big part of Jung and Lee's paper, that was my big question, was where is the psychology? If it is such a big piece, I expected more in the lit review, I expected more all around. And most importantly, I expected more of it in the interview guides, in the questions that you were asking. And I was just kind of curious that a lot of the questions that I saw in there were not as psychologically based as I thought they might be. Some of them were a little bit leading. It's, what are you going to do about a succession problem? What are you going to do when the time comes for succession? A lot of people don't succeed. A lot of people don't want to succeed. If you're telling them they are going to succeed, they're probably going to talk about it. But the bottom line is, I really liked the paper quite a bit. I really liked the story. I liked what you were suggesting. There were some things in the paper that didn't necessarily fit for me. One of them was the number of interviews. I thought 30 was not quite enough, especially coming up with 8 different dimensions and 30 single interviews with owners. There was another question I had too, is I think you said at one point in the paper, the average age of interviewees and owners was 61. And then at another point in the paper, you said it was 71. Well, I could be wrong about that, but that could get you into trouble. But I really did. I liked the whole concept and idea of the paper. I just thought there was some tightening up, and of course, John has really hit on those, specifically that psychological element that I thought was so important that wasn't necessarily solidified, especially in the lit review.
Excellent, excellent. I really appreciate the feedback. And regarding the number of interviews, John, do you have any recommendation? In fact, I suggested Leah to do like that. Yes, as much as possible like that. Then now I'm a little bit regretting. Maybe we should have focused 4 or 5 representative forms and make more interview with more people in one form. Maybe 3 to 5 people repeated 2-3 times, but only with the 3 form or 5 forms like that. What do you think, John or also Steve?
I just got back from a dissertation defense where there was about 29, I guess, or 28 interviews for to build out a theory on entrepreneurial pivoting. I guess the thing that you have to do, because you're going back and forth between your data, the key is to build out enough interviews such that you can reach what you would determine to be theoretical saturation.
Yeah.
And some people can do it with 2 cases, right? Some people can do it with 100.
Steve, only 1 cases, but many interviews, right?
Right, exactly. Longitudinal case study, for example. So you hope that I don't think there's a finite number of interviews you have to do. The goal is to do enough back and forth with your qualitative studies to reach that saturation point. So for example, if you were going to be looking at comparing like younger family firm founders versus older family firm founders, well, Kathleen Eisenhart, that's her trick. That's what she's been doing for her whole career, which is she'd do like 10 of one and 10 of the other, and then say, what's the differences, right? So it's all about it. It's allowing the theoretical, when you're doing your axial coding, for example, if you keep finding the same things, you keep falling into the same buckets, it's like we probably got another 50 isn't going to change this, another 10 isn't going to change. We keep finding the same themes. Once that happens, you've reached theoretical saturation. Now, where, how many is, don't know.
In fact, with that, a very interesting question. with Leah, we had a discussion. We discussed about it before. So I wanted to have more interview with the same person or the several person in one company. But Leah, who was leading the interview in French, her feedback was once she had one interview with the owner, there is no more question to ask. So when we meet another person in the same company, basically it was the same. So she was not very motivated to interview repeatedly or another interview with the same company, right? Leah, could you please comment on your impression?
Yeah. Yeah, normally I try to get the perspective from the owner and the successor, and what for the questions that interests us the most about the psychological journey of the incumbent, we can have some supplementary informations from the others, but then the contribution becomes like smaller and smaller. And for me, it's really more interesting to hear more people. And because we all have different psychological background, and which really burdens from the past that really contributing to how they behave now. And for me, I think that is more interesting to see more cases rather than going deeper with the same person or collecting different perspectives, it's like how people think this person's psychological journey should be.
I would echo Steve's points though about how careful you have to be in sort of leading the witness, right? So for example, with this qualitative study from this weekend for the dissertation, it was a very conscious effort was made on the interview process to not use certain words, because it could prime you prime the response that you want, so to speak. So for example, in this guy's study, it's about entrepreneurial pivoting. At no point in his question protocol does he use that word. And in fact, he doesn't even say the word pivoting. Now it could pop up, but that's what qualitative studies are about. So I think Steve's advice is very, very important when you're when you're building out an interview guide.
Can I make one more quick comment? Again, the paper, it flows nicely, it reads nicely, but I did notice there's a lot of subjectivity in the paper. A lot of personal thought, a lot of personal ideas. And that was the only other comment I wanted to make, is that a lot of sentences did not have citations to them that I thought really needed them. And I thought that might get you into trouble too. I mean, especially in the first few pages, there was just a lot of citation work that needed to be done. If there was no citation, leave the sentence in.
Definitely. And how do you think about it for the discussion part when we are building and the story? And in that part, maybe there's less citation needed. Like, do we have more freedom to describe?
That's your story, and you can. A lot of times, qualitative studies get into trouble. Reviewers get wrapped up because it's like you're so far off the reservation that you know. Like you're just speculating, kind of stuff. I think the really nice qualitative studies that I've worked with as an AE or I've been involved with in this large review thing I'm doing is that they tend to kind of connect back to theoretical contributions or theoretical connections that make sense with what they have. So you're not completely off the farm, kind of thing. So yeah.
And I just have, sorry, one more thing, if it helps at all. One of the things that I take very seriously is when you're doing a study, when you're looking at family firms, it's a question of which generation you're looking at. I noticed in terms of succession, you're really looking at that first generation. And the question for me is always, well, what happens with entrepreneurship? What happens with succession when you're looking at third, fourth, fifth generation?
Yeah.
And to bring back Peter's study again, Jaskiewicz study, they go into the 11th generation looking at these family firms. Now that's not really possible for us, but in Germany, you have a lot of family firms that are, 9, 10, 11, 12 generations old. France, probably the same thing. So, you know, is there entrepreneurship as you go further and further down that succession train? And that's, I think, important, especially from a psychological perspective for your paper. So just another
The generation, yeah, great.
generational perspective.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
Yeah, who is doing the succession? First generation, second generation, third. I think you only go to second generation. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
And you
Great.
admit it's in your limitations, but there are, in my mind, there were a few too many limitations in your limitations section.
Uh-huh. So this part need to be enriched. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Wow. And how do you guys think about the theoretical propositions in the end? Is that necessary, and how important that? Like suggesting hypotheses is to be tested future
Yes, Steve
with
did it
quantitative
in his paper.
studies. Yeah. How
Really,
necessary is that?
really interesting qualitative studies tend to have very, very long discussion sections. The bulk of the paper is about what you built and explain what the process, if it's a process model, how the process works, what are the contextual effects and important qualifiers that influence that process, for example. So generally, the bulk of the paper is actually your theory, right? Your theoretical understanding based upon your data. And then from that, you can come up with some propositions as they unfold. If it's appropriate, you let your data guide your data and your insights guide your, in other words, it may not be, you may not feel confident enough. I'm just making this, you know,
Yeah.
a person may not feel confident enough to say, we think this is a proposition, so then don't make it, right? But if you feel your data and your model are sufficient enough to make such a proposition, then do so.
Great. Not
Great.
necessary, but it's good to have. Great.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I'm
And
gonna
with
go,
Mhm.
sorry.
Steve, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to just go back in terms of theoretical contributions to what John originally brought up and what you mentioned. You kind of bring back into the flow, but not until theoretical contributions, which is the psychological journey. And you specifically state psychological journey. And it for me, it was kind of lost a little bit in the middle and then brought back in the end. And I think John mentioned that at the beginning, that, you know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but strengthen that.
That's good. That's good. And within that realm, I was always wondering, like, how about the term that you use, and do you try to bring them closer to an existing term, a construct that existed in the literature, in order to make your proposition, or you can freely term things with your own words and making propositions based on that, and how comfortable, like, do you do that?
You want to say about the construct? Yeah, new construct, right?
Yeah, the new construct. Yeah.
If you propose a new construct or a new process or a new relationship, and there are connections to prior literature or theory, sure, yeah, you can say it operates like this, but it's different like that, you know. So you have the freedom to, you know, we're not, you know, again, what I mentioned earlier. Qualitative, I work with some qualitative folks, and the big criticism they always have is sometimes people kind of go off the farm and just, you know, think that they've created something completely and absolutely new. Generally speaking, there are ways to justify a construct by tying it to other, you know, constructs that are similar and pointing out what the differences are. So this unwinding thing is very important. Levels of analysis are hugely important in qualitative study, and I think some of Steve's points are getting to that, right?
Yeah.
Is this an individual level process? If so, the individual level constructs are going to be in the conversation.
Yeah, well, interesting. So I just understand, as I understand you, actually, we do have actually even more theoretical reviews to work for each dimension and that way we named. And actually, we should back it up with the literature, actually, in order to really, in the discussion.
Justified if you need to, right? If it's appropriate.
Okay, that's work actually. It needs to be done. And yeah, I think that like Steve said, that you feel like this psychological discussion is kind of disappearing in the middle, and it's very, very, very interesting.
So yeah, so that's again, these are your stories. This is here's a big gap. We don't have empirical evidence. We have these literature streams that have talked about it. Here's a piece of the literature stream that hasn't been talked about. And so we are going to conduct a qualitative study. Here's our qualitative, data. And then you use quotes and statements and points to help build out your answer to that research question. And it's a blank, whatever it is. And you can call what you want. It's yours.
Time is almost up, and we feel like we are very old to John and Steve about the comment. So to help Steve, maybe I can make a short, brief comment.
Please.
In fact, in South Korea, there are chaebol, the big, large corporations, and they have many subsidiaries or sister or children companies, and they are using tunneling, so supporting one company's research to grow the other company intentionally, because to transfer the wealth to the next generation illegally without paying the tax. It's
Right.
illegal. The problem is each individual company, they have their own shareholders, they're public companies, but still they have the power as a patriarchy to do that kind of a tunneling. So I think it'd be very interesting for you to look into.
So look at and I'm sorry, I know chaebol, but pronounce it correctly for me.
Chaebol is okay. Chaebol, it's
chaebol.
okay. Yes, yes.
Chaebol.
Samsung, LG, Hyundai, all the Korean companies.
I think it's interesting if you did it at sort of a macro level, a conversation between whether this entrepreneurial cascade is in related versus unrelated startups. So to what extent is the paternalistic behavior spreading out to where it's taking into account sort of an overarching desire to be in this industry space, for example, versus it goes in lots of other different directions, right? Based upon the entrepreneurial leanings of the second and subsequent generations. And that's a story that's never been told that I'm aware of. So it gets you into your point, which is it related or unrelated entrepreneurial launch, activities that are being encouraged here? Just interesting.
Interesting. Okay, good. One quick question I had, and I know we're over time, did folks have trouble with my lit review? I had heard from somebody they found it very kind of confusing and a little too much.
I would speak about the literature streams that you want to contribute to, and not get into the weeds on how you're going to fit this into that stream. Your goal is to identify where this, and I keep going, I don't want to pick on Peter, but Peter and others have talked about these types of things, and you kind of address sort of what they've come up with. And then your big point is that this literature stream about how entrepreneurship moves through generations of family firms has looked like this, but nobody's really talked about how this particular move, these are the things that we don't understand completely. And so my research questions are do, or whatever they are. So again, typically the qualitative studies have a very short intro, a very short conversation about the literature stream they want to talk about. And then the bulk of the paper is the build out of the analyses and the building of your model.
Great, great. Thank you very much.
And you may circle back to that stuff
Yep.
that you have in your current literature. Yeah, absolutely. But
Mhm.
you know, your story is the important story, not whether you prove or disprove what others have done.
Got it.
You may support it, you may find it's different. You may say it's, well,
It's a level of insecurity. It's what that really is. You feel you
What's
need to
that?
ground it. It's a level of insecurity to feel you need to ground it in somebody else's theory rather than just on your own.
exactly. And there's a young doctoral student that when I was down for this defense, and she's her phrase to me was it's a confidence thing, and I thought, well, yeah, that's right. It's sort of like, you know, we're taught to build a theory. Where's the gap? Here's the
Yeah.
specifics. Here's the method. With qualitative study, you have more freedom, and you have confidence in your. She says it's all about confidence. I said, well,
Exactly.
it's probably true.
Excellent. Yeah, based
Don't
on
be
John's
afraid.
comment, yes, according to John, Steve, you and us, I think we need to release. So we need to release possessive bond theory, and in your case, a nudging theory or any kind of theory. Reduce it from this amount to here. Then we need to focus on the discussion, generating theory part, and only try to relate with some part of the literature review.
We need to unlearn.
Yeah, it's your thing, not how it fits into their thing.
Good. Thank you very much.
Excellent, John. Mhm.
It's an inspirational feedback session. I love it.
Oh, wonderful!
I love it
hope
too.
this was
Thank you.
helpful.
Yeah, I love it.
I enjoy reading these types of studies. It's hard to publish qualitative work because of just the way reviewers look at it. So the key is to be careful, get a lot of feedback, and that's what you do.
Tighten it up.
So
Thank
was this
you.
helpful? Was
Very
it
I
helpful?
absolutely
Very
appreciate it.
John.
I really
Thanks
appreciate
very
it
much.
so much.
Wonderful. Leah, like I said, I was just real quickly, I'd mentioned we're doing if you give me, this is my paper I'm talking about. We believe that family business research has somewhat ignored what the practitioners are actually doing. And we think, for example, family business consultants or advisors on their web pages, right? They're providing services to family businesses, and there's a long list of these services. And they wouldn't be providing those services if there wasn't obviously incentives to do so. So our big book chapter I got to work on today is trying to link the themes of family business research with what the practitioner consultants and advisors are actually offering family businesses, and are there big gaps there? So like with your foundation, the questions you get asked to solve are probably potential research questions that we can explore and study on the research side.
Absolutely.
So it's what are some of the, just real quick, I mean, nobody has really covered the ground around addiction and family. They just haven't. And yet there are services and consultants and advisors connecting people to help solve that family business problem, right? And so
addiction and how addiction affects the succession process, how addiction affects I'm curious.
Well, just to me, I mean, again, this is a qualitative study waiting to happen, which is, how addiction, like real addiction, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, whatever they are, the implications of that for family business the families and the business, right? And the conversation around how that can unfold in a family and in a business.
Interesting question. I mean, I've got an employee who abused
Absolutely.
alcohol to a significant degree. And in the back of my mind, and this is somebody who I see is taking over the business someday soon, because I feel his previous addiction, is an advantage. And an advantage in the sense that if I can transform that addiction to an addiction for the business, for sales, for individual parts of the company, that to me, his addiction is an advantage, and his addictive personality is an advantage. It's interesting. I mean, I know it sounds farcical almost.
This is the kind of stuff that, as all four of us know, academic research is about 20 years behind what's actually happening in the real world, right?
Oh yeah.
You just said, Steve, what a crazy conversation that could be, right? In a journal.
In my mind, it makes complete sense.
Well, but what I'm saying is it's stuff like that that's happening in the real practice of, and what's really happening in family enterprises, that it's not that we're ignoring it as scholars. It's just we hadn't gotten our act together to figure it out, right?
No, I guarantee you there's no theory behind anything like that.
Exactly. So this whole addiction conversation, that's just an example of one of the things that we learned, which was family business consultants, advisors, and so on that are working, that are in the field, working with real people in real family enterprises. They're doing stuff that we haven't even looked at yet. And so that's the purpose of the book chapter, is to talk about that.
That's amazing. Wow.
You're unfolding your psychological unwinding thing, right? A much deeper dive in sort of the health effects of this on founders. And there's a wonderful story, I think, around the rejection of the family business by successors.
Yeah.
That rejection process is not unexplored, right?
Totally. That's our next research topic, actually. Rejection process.
So another one, right, that we kind of picked up on was how non-family business assets are viewed by extended family members. And it's almost like Steve's thing, right? Addiction as a positive. You would think, in my work with some family businesses when I was in Texas, they have these mammoth family, multi-generational. They have massive wealth and they have massive assets. And so the conversation is well, wouldn't everybody want to have the family asset of the big, cool, wonderful, fun ranch? And you talk to them, you talk to the extended family, and they would say, I don't want that. Why don't you have it? Because I get to still use it and I don't have to take care of it. So it's a sharing of the family wealth, the SEW stuff, but it's the actual wealth, the sharing of that. And people want to have access to it, but they don't want to own it, right? So if I have the ranch, well, then now I got to keep the fun boats going and the house going, and I got to keep the water running and all that. Meanwhile, my cousin just shows up with his family, destroys the place, and then says, nice to see you again. So you have this bizarre behavior of not wanting to own the extended, it's just amazing stuff.
Wow.
And then another cool thing that when I teach family business topics is about young people, young college age people who are going to become the successor. And they're sitting in that classroom and they've got a story to tell. And sometimes it is a very frightening story. And here are these 20-year-old young people who are faced with, well, I watched my dad fire my mom, and it's like, the responsibility I feel to take over this business. What if I screw it up? And when all these things running through these young people's minds, it's terrifying in some instances. It's also, it's a revelation. Anyway, these are some of the things we're learning.
I think the connection with Family Firm Institute, with what Dita's doing with FFI, kind of bringing the consultants together with more the theorists. I kind of wonder if that has had some positive effect on, new, more relevant theory. I don't know.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
Let's hope so. We've got so much to learn. The rejection of the family business is something that is amazing to me.
Yeah,
that's what it happened in my family. My grandfather owned a foundry for 50 years. He had 2 daughters. They had sons, me, right? I didn't want it. Like, what does that do? So, like, Leah, what does your group of older entrepreneurs have to say about having a family business they want to have a successor for, and no one wants it? And that's a story. And why?
Absolutely.
Why?
Absolutely.
Why?
mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have a multi-million-dollar established business with established customers, and it's all here. You show up. Nobody wants it.
And I really love that the example you share, like in the young people's mind, they have a lot of fear, and that is a psychological issue. Like, again, like they have some dysfunctional way of thinking, how they perceive owning a business, and
some of them feel like they have no, like, I don't even get to decide my own life. It's already been decided for me.
If it is fear, like you said, Leah, it's if that is the right word, then it's unwinding fear, unpacking what fear is. And I think it's from a psychological perspective, a very interesting, very interesting thing to think about.
Yeah,
anyway.
And the dysfunctional thoughts, ways of thinking.
Anyway, I didn't mean to go down my road.
That's okay, but I'm very happy to read it if you needed a very simple perspective.
Yeah, it's due yesterday.
I can read it fast, but I can't read it in reverse.
Okay, all right. Well, anyway, I hope I didn't dominate the conversation or anything like that. I get excited about this stuff. I hope this was helpful. It was a great conversation. Hopefully we can get together at FERC in person, make it a live thing. And I look forward to seeing you all.
Good. Thank you, John. Thank you very much.
I haven't heard, like, where you guys are situated, just really quick. Are you from US, both? Which?
And I'm at NC State in Raleigh, North Carolina.
And I'm outside of Boston at Babson College in Wellesley, Massachusetts.
Wow.
Lausanne, Switzerland.
And Germany. Wow, I really hope that if you come to Europe and we're gonna meet, that would be a dream. Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
John, do you have a link for the recorded, or is that something we can all kind of access?
Well, I recorded in my computer, and once I process that, I will share with you.
Perfect.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a great day there. Bye. Bye.
Bye.